and welcome to Econ 22 News Channel's Ukrainian fiscal policy debate. I'm Lexi, and today Maya and I will discuss whether Ukraine should adopt expansionary fiscal policy in order to stimulate economic growth, or maintain neutral fiscal policy to further encourage currently growing private investment resulting from loosening monetary policy. For some background on the current policies and economic situation, we will turn to Maya on the ground in Kiev. For starters, Maya, what is your feel for the current economic and political situation in Ukraine?
In April 2019, the president, Vladimir Zelensky, was elected in a landslide victory on the promise of increasing transparency and reducing corruption. He still maintains widespread support and is prioritizing ending the conflict with Russia over the Crimean Peninsula. Because of Zelensky's promise of honesty, increasingly reliable central banking, and loosening monetary policy, trust in the economy is growing and private investment is increasing. However, fear about the coronavirus is growing, and a hoax email led violent protesters to hurl rocks at buses carrying Wuhan refugees. Still, it remains unclear how significant of an effect the coronavirus will have on the Ukrainian economy.
Very interesting. Maya, let's talk a little bit about economic growth and the government budget deficit in Ukraine. As I understand it, economic growth in Ukraine has been volatile for the past few years. Furthermore, despite a recent fall, Ukraine's general government deficit is expected to run about 2% over the next few years. Could you talk a little bit about these factors?
Certainly, Lexi. Ukraine's GDP was hurt by the political crisis of 2014 and 2015, but has been gradually recovering since, largely due to loose monetary policy and increasing trust in the government and central bank. It is expected to grow at 3.5% in 2020 and increase to 4% in the following years. The 2019 primary budget deficit was 0.7% of GDP and is expected to run about 2% over the next couple of years. This deficit is largely financed by the government issuing bonds. Because of the expected decrease in inflation over the next year that we discussed in our monetary policy debate, this deficit is not likely to cause a problematic spike in inflation. As you can see from the graph, the debt-to-GDP ratio has been relatively volatile in years past due to the crisis of 2014, but has been decreasing since and is expected to fall below 50% in the next 3 years. As long as GDP continues to grow and the government holds true to the projected 2% budget deficit, the Ukraine can maintain the trend shown by the arrow.
Thank you, Maya. Based on this update, it seems that Ukraine's economy is still not growing at quite the desirable rate, and that coronavirus presents additional risks to sustain growth. Despite growing public trust, GDP growth has been slow, stagnant, and disappointing. After a recent mission to Kiev in September of 2019, the IMF commended Ukraine for the economic growth they have accomplished since the crises of 2014 to 2015. However, they noted that this growth is happening far too slowly. The IMF recommends that economic policies will need to be focused on maintaining macroeconomic stability while creating the conditions for achieving faster growth. This is why I recommend that Ukraine adopt expansionary fiscal policy, which fuels economic growth. The two major examples of expansionary policy are tax cuts and increased government spending. Both are favorable policies for even corrupt politicians because the public likes lower taxes and higher government spending. Thus, these policies increase a politician's electability. This leads to a risk of expansionary policy getting out of hand, as government officials grow afraid of discontinuing these policies. However, considering the level of corruption in Ukraine, economists should embrace expansionary fiscal policy as something government officials may actually be willing to accept and implement. Both tax decreases and increased government spending are intended to increase aggregate demand, which fuels economic growth. Lowering taxes means that the average person has more money to spend or invest, which fuels higher aggregate demand. This higher demand causes firms to hire more, which decreases unemployment. Ukraine has a moderately high level of unemployment and a very high level of youth unemployment, as qualified young people are crowded out of the private sector by barriers to investment and land grants, and by the need for kleptocratic connections to find high-paying employment. Thus, there is a high need for increased employment within Ukraine. Increased demand also causes firms to compete more fiercely for labor. This could cause firms to abandon some of their kleptocratic procedures and adopt more merit-based hiring practices. Further, competition for labor raises wages in the market, which provides consumers with even more money to spend and invest. This creates a cycle of increasing investment that facilitates economic growth. Higher government spending also increases employment, particularly when the government is sponsoring public works projects. This in turn increases aggregate demand, facilitating growth. Expansionary fiscal policy is characterized by deficit spending. However, I believe that the economy of Ukraine is so stagnant that some government spending is a necessary evil, as long as policies are put in place ahead of time to prevent growth from getting out of hand, and to prevent the government from failing to abandon expansionary policies in the name of electability. While kleptocratic investment and employment barriers will still exist in Ukraine, higher levels of market activity and growing competition will allow many young people to break through the system and find employment that suits their qualifications. This will lead to the sustainable economic growth that Ukraine desperately needs. Let's turn to Maya in Ukraine again and see if she agrees with my policy recommendations.
Thanks, Lexi. While the Ukrainian economy could certainly be growing faster, I believe that the current economic situation necessitates institutional change to promote sustainable growth, rather than expansionary fiscal policy, which will only provide a temporary solution to its economic problems. The recent loosening of monetary policy and currently neutral fiscal policy has caused the economy of the Ukraine to grow about 3.5% because of the resulting private investment and increasing confidence in the economy. Therefore, the government should continue to carry out neutral fiscal policy so as to not crowd out the currently increasing private investment and exacerbate the already high debt-to-GDP ratio. As we discussed in the introduction, the debt-to-GDP ratio is currently about 60%. Because this is relatively high and the primary deficit is expected to run about 2%, it is important to look at the interest rates of the current debt to evaluate how realistic the projected decline in the debt-to-GDP ratio actually is. As you can see from the chart, most of the Ukraine's public debt is financed by issuing government securities, both internally and externally. The average interest rate on these securities is about 8.1%, which is extremely high compared to the U.S. average of about 1.3%. This is important because it means that the total deficit will actually be much larger than the primary deficit, and to grow out of its debt, the Ukraine must continue to increase GDP while trying to avoid taking on more debt in the long term. Because the economic situation has been relatively turbulent in the past few years, and the Ukraine is only starting to resume growth, I do not recommend that they begin contractionary fiscal policy to try to lower the debt-to-GDP ratio yet. However, the current debt situation of the country simply cannot handle the tax cuts and increased government spending that Lexi suggests without sending the debt-to-GDP ratio spiraling upward. Another important consideration is Ukraine's recently rising private sector investment due to lower interest rates that have caused much of the recent economic growth. A big concern with the expansionary policy that Lexi is suggesting is that it could crowd out the new private investment. Furthermore, it is important to recognize that if this crowding out occurs, it will also hurt GDP growth, which combined with mounting deficits could be catastrophic for the economy. Lastly, because tax cuts and government spending are very popular with the people, they will be nearly impossible to reverse. Furthermore, the increasingly turbulent global economy, rocked by coronavirus, bushfires, and the trade war between the U.S. and China, raises questions about potential need for more deficit spending in the future. Based on the current broader economic situation, I believe that the Ukraine should maintain neutral fiscal policy in the medium term. But based on the budget and debt statistics, it might be necessary to move towards contractionary in the future. Thanks for watching our debate, and tune in next term for some new perspectives.